Denied entry to the feast. Cubs brought platters to the human. The stars stretched endlessly beyond the viewport of the horizon's edge as Commander Jake Morrison guided his ship toward Valoris Prime. He had been traveling for 3 weeks to reach this moment, carrying with him the hopes of humanity's first real chance at galactic recognition. The planet below shimmered with lights from thousands of structures, each one more magnificent than anything humans had built. This was the center of galactic civilization, where the Council made decisions that affected billions of lives across hundreds of starry systems. Jake adjusted his formal uniform one more time and checked his appearance in the small mirror beside his command chair. His crew had worked tirelessly to prepare for this moment. Lieutenant Sophie Barnes stood at the navigation console, her fingers dancing across holographic displays as she synchronized their approach vector with station control. Ryan Hughes sat hunched over his datapad, reviewing cultural protocols for the 50th time that morning. Lisa Grant checked her equipment at the security station, her face calm but alert as always. The orbital station appeared ahead, a massive ring of metal and crystal that caught the light of 3 suns. Ships from across the galaxy docked at its numerous ports, each vessel representing a civilization that had earned the right to attend the Triumph Feast. Jake felt a mixture of pride and nervousness as he maneuvered the horizon's edge toward their assigned docking bay. Humanity had achieved so much in just 3 centuries of space travel. They had colonized 3 star systems, developed medical technology that saved millions of lives, and helped end a brutal war between 2 species in the Outer Rim. Surely that would be enough. The docking procedure went smoothly, and soon Jake led his small team through the station's corridors toward the reception hall. Other delegations passed them, beings of every imaginable shape and form. Some walked on multiple legs, others floated through the air, and a few seemed to be made of light itself. Guards in ornate armor stood at regular intervals, their weapons gleaming but holstered. Everything spoke of ancient power and established order. At the entrance to the main reception hall, a tall reptilian figure waited. His scales were deep blue with silver markings that indicated high rank among his people. This was High Arbiter Zethkor of the Vexthari, the species responsible for managing entry to the Triumph Feast. Jake had read about the Vexthari during his preparation. They had held their position as gatekeepers for over 2,000 years, and they took their duties very seriously. Jake stepped forward and offered a formal greeting in the common galactic language. He presented his credentials on a data crystal that contained proof of humanity's achievements. Zethkor took the crystal without comment and inserted it into a reading device that materialized in his clawed hand. The silence stretched as the Arbiter reviewed the information, his vertical pupils scanning back and forth across invisible text. Finally, Zethkor looked up. His expression was unreadable, but something in his posture suggested dismissal before he even spoke. The Arbiter's voice was cold and precise as he delivered his judgment. Humanity did not meet the requirements for attendance at the Triumph Feast. Their species was classified as cubs, too young and inexperienced to participate in the gathering of established civilizations. Jake felt his heart sink, but he maintained his composure. He asked what specific requirements humanity had failed to meet. Zethakor's response came smoothly, as if he had given this speech many times before. To attend the feast, a species must control at least 50 star systems. Humanity controlled only 3. They must maintain a fleet of no fewer than 10,000 capital ships. Humanity had perhaps 300. They must present cultural artifacts proving at least 5,000 years of recorded space travel. Humanity had been among the stars for barely 3 centuries. Finally, they must be sponsored by 3 current council members. Humanity had no sponsors. Sophie stepped forward to argue, but Jake raised a hand to stop her. He knew that debating with Zethkor would accomplish nothing. The requirements were clearly designed to exclude younger species like humanity. What puzzled Jake was why these particular numbers had been chosen. They seemed arbitrary, more like barriers than genuine standards of achievement. Zethkor continued with what felt like rehearsed politeness. Perhaps humanity could return in another millennium or 2, once they had matured sufficiently. Until then, they were dismissed. The Arbiter made it clear that humans could not even observe the feast from the lower galleries, a privilege sometimes granted to developing species. Humanity was being shut out completely. Jake thanked Zethkor for his time, keeping his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. He turned and led his team back toward their ship. Sophie was furious, her face red as she muttered angry comments about unfair standards and corrupt bureaucracy. Ryan looked defeated, all his careful preparation rendered useless. Lisa remained quiet, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her hand kept drifting toward her empty weapon holster. As they walked through the docking bay, Jake noticed something that made him pause. Several smaller vessels nearby belonged to species he recognized from his research. The Drathic Collective had a ship docked 3 berths away. Jake knew that the Drathic had been spacefaring for only 200 years and controlled maybe a dozen systems. Yet their delegation was apparently welcome at the feast. Further down, he spotted a vessel belonging to the Quilnari Union, another young species with limited territory and resources. Something did not add up. If the requirements were truly as strict as Zethkor claimed, these other species should not have qualified either. Jake filed this observation away as his team boarded the horizon's edge. Once inside, Sophie immediately started venting her frustration, pacing back and forth in the small command deck. Ryan slumped in his chair, looking like someone who had failed an important test. Lisa stood by the airlock, her expression thoughtful. Jake called for attention and told his crew that they were not leaving the system yet. If humanity could not attend the feast, at least they could learn why the standards seemed so inconsistent. He ordered Sophie to move the ship to the edge of the star system, beyond normal sensor range but close enough to monitor communications. Ryan looked up with renewed interest, already reaching for his translation equipment. Lisa nodded approvingly and moved to activate the ship's passive scanning arrays. As the horizon's edge drifted away from the orbital station, Jake stood at the viewport and watched Valoris Prime slowly shrink in the distance. The rejection stung, but it also awakened something in him. Humanity had not come this far by accepting arbitrary limitations. They had overcome countless obstacles by questioning assumptions and finding new solutions. This would be no different. The triumph feast was about to begin below, and the galaxy's elite would gather to celebrate their own importance. But Jake Morrison and his crew would be watching from the shadows, searching for answers. They had been denied entry as cubs, dismissed as too young to matter. Perhaps it was time to show the galaxy what cubs could do when they refused to accept their place. Denied entry to the feast, cubs brought Platters to the human. The horizon's edge floated quietly at the edge of the Valoris system, its sensors absorbing every transmission and signal that crossed the void. Jake Morrison sat in his command chair, watching data scroll across multiple screens as his crew worked to understand what was happening at the feast they had been forbidden to attend. 3 days had passed since their rejection, and the information they were gathering painted a troubling picture of galactic politics. Ryan Hughes had barely slept during those 3 days. His workspace was covered with translation matrices, diplomatic records, and communication intercepts. He looked exhausted but excited as he presented his findings to Jake and the others. The guest list for the Triumph Feast told a story that contradicted everything High Arbiter Zethkor had claimed about requirements and standards. The Drathic Collective controlled only 12 star systems, not 50. They had been spacefaring for exactly 190 years, far less than the supposed 5,000-year requirement. Their military fleet consisted of perhaps 800 ships, nowhere near 10,000. Yet they sat at the feast dining with the Council elite. Ryan pulled up more examples. The Quilnari Union had even fewer systems and a smaller fleet. The Torvan Assembly had only recently developed faster-than-light travel. All of these species were younger than humanity by any measurable standard, yet all had been welcomed, while humans were turned away. Sophie asked the obvious question. What did these species have that humanity lacked? Ryan had found the answer buried in historical records and financial documents. Every one of these species had either ancient bloodline connections to founding council races, or they had paid enormous tribute in resources and technology. The Drathic had discovered a rare mineral that the council valued highly, and they shipped it to Valoris Prime regularly. The Quilnari had given the council access to advanced biotechnology that their species had developed. The Torvan had simply pledged their entire military to serve council interests. The feast was not about achievement or merit. It was about connections, tribute, and maintaining a system where the powerful stayed powerful and the weak remained dependent. Jake felt anger building in his chest, but it was a cold, calculated anger. This was not just about humanity being insulted. This was about a fundamental corruption at the heart of galactic governance. Lisa suggested they should simply leave and report their findings to Earth's government. Let humanity's leaders decide how to respond to this hypocrisy. But Jake saw something more than just an injustice to expose. He saw an opportunity. If the system was corrupt, it could be challenged. If the standards were arbitrary, they could be changed. But they needed more than observations from a distance. They needed real evidence, the kind that could not be dismissed or explained away. Sophie proposed a covert insertion. Their small diplomatic shuttle might be able to slip past the station's security if piloted carefully enough. The risk was enormous. If they were caught spying on the Council, humanity could face sanctions or worse. Their home systems might be blockaded, their ships forbidden from traveling through Council-controlled space. Jake wrestled with the decision, knowing that his choice could affect billions of people back on Earth and the colonies. Before he could decide, an incoming transmission interrupted their debate. The communication was encrypted but used standard diplomatic channels. Ryan quickly worked to decode it, his fingers flying across his console. When the message finally appeared, everyone gathered around to read it. The text was brief and cryptic. It came from several species that Jake recognized as observers at the feast, younger civilizations that had been granted limited access to the outer proceedings. The message invited Commander Morrison to meet them at coordinates on Valoris Prime's third moon. The location was remote and unmonitored. The message specifically requested that Jake come alone, or with minimal security, and promised to share important information. Lisa immediately declared it was obviously a trap. Sophie agreed, pointing out that they had no reason to trust these unknown species. Ryan was more optimistic, noting that the message included proper authentication codes from 4 different civilizations, all of whom had publicly expressed frustration with Council policies. Jake studied the coordinates and considered his options. He decided to take the risk. If this was a trap, they would face it. If it was genuine, they might gain valuable allies. He chose to take only Lisa for security and prepared to pilot a shuttle down to the moon's surface. Sophie protested, wanting to accompany them, but Jake needed her to stay with the ship and be ready to extract them if things went wrong. Ryan would continue gathering intelligence from the communication intercepts. The shuttle descended through empty space toward the barren moon. Its surface was gray and lifeless, pocked with craters from ancient impacts. Jake spotted their destination, a small prefabricated structure sitting alone in a shallow valley. He brought the shuttle down smoothly and checked his equipment before opening the airlock. Lisa was already armed and scanning for threats, her training evident in every careful movement. They entered the structure through a standard airlock and found themselves in a simple meeting room. 6 beings waited for them, representing 6 different species. Jake recognized their characteristics from his research. The Kelthari were insectoid, their chitinous bodies covered in intricate patterns. The Phazon were aquatic creatures in specialized environment suits. The Orvani resembled mammals with thick fur and intelligent eyes. 3 other species completed the group, each one unique in appearance but sharing the same expression of cautious hope. The Kelthari stepped forward and introduced himself as Clickthrum, using a translation device that rendered his clicking language into words Jake could understand. Clickthrum explained that they had been watching humanity for some time. They saw how humans built alliances based on respect rather than dominance. They noticed how humans shared technology freely rather than hoarding it for advantage. They observed how humans solved problems through creativity rather than appealing to authority. These qualities made humanity different from most species trying to climb the galactic hierarchy. Most cubs accepted their inferior position and worked desperately to gain favor with the elder races, hoping for eventual promotion. But Clickthrum had lived a long time, and in all his years he had never seen a cub species elevated to full council membership. The system was designed to keep them subordinate. Forever. Clickthrum revealed what life was like for observer species at the Triumph Feast. They were allowed into the outer rings where they served the elder species like waiters and entertainers. They carried platters of food, poured drinks, cleaned messes, and provided amusement. In exchange, they received scraps of outdated technology and empty promises that someday, if they proved themselves worthy, they might earn true membership. But the truth was darker than simple exploitation. The Triumph Feast was where the Council made its most important decisions. Trade routes were established, resources were allocated, territorial disputes were settled, and policies were set that affected the entire galaxy. Species excluded from the feast had no voice in these decisions, yet they were forced to live by them. The observer species could watch from the margins, serving and hoping, but they could never participate in the discussions that shaped their futures. Jake asked why humanity had been specifically targeted for rejection. Click-Thrum's answer confirmed Jake's suspicions. The Council had been monitoring humanity's rapid advancement with growing concern. Humans were developing too quickly, forming too many independent alliances and showing too much innovation. They represented a potential threat to the established order. By denying humans entry now, the Council hoped to slow their momentum and keep them marginalized until they could be properly controlled or absorbed into the existing power structure. Lisa asked why Click-Thrum and the others were revealing this information. What did they hope to gain by helping humanity? The Kalthari's response was simple and powerful. They believed humans might be the catalyst for real change. Every other young species had eventually bent to the Council's will, accepting their place in the hierarchy. But humanity seemed different. Humans questioned authority, challenged assumptions, and refused to accept limitations they considered unjust. The observer species had been watching and waiting for someone who might help them break free from the cycle of servitude. They thought humanity might be that someone, but they needed help. They proposed working together to expose the Council's corruption to the broader galactic community. Most civilizations had no idea how the system truly functioned. If the truth were revealed publicly, it might force reforms or create opportunities for alternatives. Jake realized this was far bigger than his hurt pride or humanity's wounded dignity. This was about the future of how species interacted across the galaxy. He thought about all the young civilizations being exploited, all the potential being suppressed, all the innovation being stifled to maintain the comfort of the powerful. He looked at Click-Thrum and the other representatives and saw hope mixed with desperation in their expressions. He agreed to help them. Together, they would find a way to disrupt the feast and expose the truth. Denied entry to the feast, Cubs brought Platters to the human Jake Morrison returned to the horizon's edge with a new sense of purpose burning in his chest. He gathered his crew in the command deck and explained everything he had learned from Click-Thrum and the other observer species. Sophie, Ryan, and Lisa listened with growing amazement and anger as Jake described the exploitation system that masqueraded as galactic civilization. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence before Sophie spoke. She said this changed everything. They were not just dealing with a personal insult anymore. This was about the future of dozens of species and maybe the entire galaxy. Ryan nodded enthusiastically and immediately started pulling up the files that Click-Thrum had provided. The Kalthari had given Jake access to their information networks, and the evidence was overwhelming. Recordings of private council sessions, financial documents showing tribute payments, testimonies from species that had been exploited for generations. Everything they needed to prove the corruption was real, but evidence alone would not be enough. They needed to present it in a way that could not be ignored or suppressed. The council controlled most major communication networks and had the power to shut down any transmissions they considered dangerous. Ryan suggested they would need to broadcast simultaneously to thousands of independent planets, using multiple relay points to make it impossible to block all the signals at once. It was technically possible, but they would need help from the observer species to set up the relay network. Lisa raised another concern. Even if they successfully broadcast the evidence, where would they get it from? The most damaging information would be happening right now at the feast itself, where the elder species were making their corrupt deals and decisions. The recordings Click-Thrum had provided were valuable, but real-time evidence of the Council's actions during the Triumph Feast would be impossible to deny. Sophie had an idea. The observer species had access to the outer rings of the feast where they served the elder races. If Jake's team could somehow join them as servants, they might be able to move through the complex undetected. The powerful rarely paid attention to those serving them food and drink. Servers were practically invisible. They could plant recording devices, gather evidence, and escape before anyone realized what was happening. Jake saw the logic in Sophie's plan. but he also understood the risks. If they were caught impersonating servants, the consequences would be severe not just for humanity, but for all the observer species who helped them. Clickthrum and his people would face terrible punishment for their conspiracy, but when Jake contacted the Kelthari to discuss the plan, Clickthrum agreed immediately. He said his people had been waiting for a chance like this for too long. They were willing to accept the risks. Over the next 2 days, Jake's team worked frantically to prepare. Ryan obtained holographic disguise emitters from the observer species, devices that could make humans appear to be Kelthari, Phazon, or other servant races. The disguises were not perfect and would not fool close scrutiny or detailed scans, but from a distance they should work well enough. Lisa helped to design small recording devices that could be disguised as jewelry or decorations and planted throughout the feast hall. Sophie spent her time studying layouts of the council complex that Clickthrum provided. She memorized entry points, security checkpoints, and patrol routes. The feast was scheduled to begin in less than 24 hours, and they would have only one chance to get this right. When the day arrived, Jake felt his stomach twist with nervous energy. He put on his disguise and watched in a mirror as his reflection shifted to show a Kelthari worker with chitinous features. Sophie became a Phazon in an environment suit. Ryan took the appearance of an Orvani servant. Lisa kept her human appearance but used a biosignature masker that would make scanners read her as a different species. They joined a group of actual observer species servants entering the feast, blending into the crowd of cubs preparing to serve their masters. The council complex was even more magnificent inside than Jake had imagined. Crystalline walls caught and refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Exotic plants from 100 worlds filled gardens and hanging displays. The main feast hall was enormous, with tables stretching as far as Jake could see, each one laden with delicacies and treasures. The ceiling showed a holographic display of the galaxy itself, slowly rotating and sparkling with countless stars. The elder species began arriving in formal procession. The Vexithari came first in their ceremonial armor, High Arbiter Zethkor leading them with proud bearing. The Altherian ascendancy followed, beings of pure energy wearing flowing garments that seemed to be made of light itself. The Kronar Dominion entered last, massive creatures in mechanical exoskeletons that made the floor shake with each step. Dozens of other elder races took their places at the tables, laughing and talking with the ease of those who knew they belonged. Jake and his team moved among them carrying platters and serving drinks. The elder species barely acknowledged their presence. A Vexithari would gesture impatiently for wine without even looking at who poured it. An Altherian would wave a hand to dismiss a servant who moved too slowly. A Kronar would push past Jake without seeming to notice he was there. To the powerful, servants were furniture rather than people. As Jake moved deeper into the complex, he began to understand the true nature of the feast. This was not primarily a celebration. It was a business meeting disguised as a party. The elder species discussed trade agreements that would cripple entire economies. They laughed about territorial acquisitions that would displace millions of beings. They casually decided the fates of species who had no representation and no voice in the decisions being made about their futures. Ryan managed to plant several recording devices near important tables where council members were gathering. He moved carefully, pretending to clean surfaces while actually placing the tiny transmitters in decorative objects and under furniture. Sophie overheard a conversation between Vexithari and Altherian diplomats about deliberately suppressing a scientific breakthrough by a younger species. The breakthrough involved faster-than-light communication technology that would make it easier for distant civilizations to coordinate with each other. The council feared this would reduce their control over information flow, so they had quietly bought the patent and buried it. Lisa worked her way through the crowd, documenting everything with a hidden camera built into her biosignature masker. She captured images of council members making deals, exchanging information, and openly discussing how to maintain their dominance over younger species. The evidence was exactly what they needed. Then disaster nearly struck. Lisa was serving drinks near a group of Kronar security officers when one of them looked at her more closely than expected. The Kronar had cybernetic enhancements, including a sophisticated scanning eye that could analyze biological signatures in detail. The officer's mechanical eye focused on Lisa, and her biosignature masker flickered for just a moment under the intensity of the scan. The Kronar's expression changed. He reached for the weapon on his belt and started to rise from his seat. Lisa froze, knowing that if the alarm was raised, everything would be lost. Jake saw what was happening from across the room but was too far away to help. Sophie and Ryan noticed the danger but could not reach Lisa in time. Then Click-Thrum himself appeared, moving with surprising speed for someone of his size. The Keltari was carrying an enormous platter piled high with delicate foods from various worlds. As the Kronar officer started to call out, Click-Thrum deliberately stumbled and dropped the entire platter directly in front of the officer. Food scattered everywhere, covering the Kronar's mechanical exoskeleton with sauces and debris. The crash was spectacular and drew immediate attention from everyone nearby. Click-Thrum fell to his knees and began apologizing profusely in the groveling manner expected of cubs serving their superiors. The Kronar officer roared in fury, more concerned about his ruined clothing than the suspicious servant he had been about to investigate. Other servants rushed over to help clean up the mess, creating chaos and confusion that allowed Lisa to slip away unnoticed. Jake knew they were out of time. The security officer might remember his suspicions once he calmed down. They had gathered enough evidence. He signaled to his team using a subtle hand gesture they had practiced. Time to leave. The four humans began moving toward the exits, still carrying their platters to maintain the appearance of servants going about their duties. But as they reached the outer halls, a familiar figure blocked their path. High Arbiter Zethkor stood flanked by armed guards, his reptilian eyes studying the servants moving past him. Something had made him suspicious. Perhaps the incident with the Kronar officer had triggered additional security alerts. Perhaps he simply had good instincts. Whatever the reason, he ordered his guards to scan everyone in the corridor. Jake knew that if they were scanned, their disguises would fail instantly. Not only would the mission be compromised, but Click-Thrum and all the observer species who had helped them would face punishment. He made a split-second decision based on instinct rather than logic. He dropped "Denied entry to the feast." Cubs brought platters to the human Jake Morrison stood facing High Arbiter Zethkor with energy weapons pointed at his chest from 3 directions. His heart hammered in his chest, but his voice remained steady as he spoke loud enough for others to hear. He declared that he had come bearing gifts for the feast, gifts that the council desperately needed whether they knew it or not. He came bearing the truth. Zethkor opened his mouth to order Jake's immediate arrest, but before he could speak, Jake activated the transmission. The signal came from Ryan's carefully planted recording devices, and from the relay network that Click-Thrum and the observer species had secretly established over the past days. In an instant, the evidence began broadcasting across thousands of communication channels to millions of worlds throughout the galaxy. Every public screen, every communication network, every news feed suddenly showed the same thing. Recordings from inside the Triumph Feast played for all to see. Council members discussing how to suppress technology that would help younger species, elder races laughing about exploitation and tribute, high-ranking diplomats openly planning to maintain their power by keeping cubs dependent and weak, financial records showing the bribes and payments that bought access to the feast, testimony from dozens of species about generations of exploitation. The galaxy watched as the corruption at the heart of their civilization was laid bare for everyone to see. Chaos erupted instantly in the council complex. Alarms began sounding as security systems detected the unauthorized transmission. Elder species at the feast scrambled to understand what was happening. Some tried to shut down the broadcast, but the relay network was too distributed and too well protected. Other council members started shouting denials and accusations at each other. Several attempted to leave the feast before they could be associated with the scandal that was unfolding. High Arbiter Zethkor roared in fury at Jake, demanding to know what he had done. But the situation was already spiraling beyond anyone's control. The broadcast reached not just the public but other council members who had not been part of the inner circle. Mid-tier species that had long suspected corruption now had proof. Younger species that had accepted their subordinate positions now understood they had been deliberately kept down. Independent worlds that had trusted the council's leadership now questioned everything. Click-Thrum and the other observer species threw off their disguises and their subservient behavior. The Keltari stood tall beside Jake, declaring that his people would no longer accept being treated as inferior. Other servants joined him, dozens of different species all refusing to continue serving the feast. The carefully maintained hierarchy that had existed for thousands of years began to crack and crumble. Sophie, Ryan, and Lisa formed a defensive position around Jake as Vexathari guards advanced. The weapons stayed trained on them, but no one fired. The guards seemed uncertain how to proceed. This was not a military attack that could be met with violence. This was information, truth spreading faster than any weapon could stop it. Killing Jake now would accomplish nothing except making him a martyr. Then something unexpected happened. A representative from the Therian assembly stood up from her table and walked toward the confrontation. The Therians were a feline species known for strategic thinking and careful diplomacy. They were considered mid-tier council members, powerful enough to have a voice but not part of the true elite. The Therian representative, a dignified female named Kessa, spoke in a voice that carried across the hall. She said that the evidence being broadcast could not be ignored or dismissed. Everyone with access to communication networks was watching it right now. The Council's corruption was exposed for the entire galaxy to see. If they did not address this immediately and transparently, the Council would lose all legitimacy and authority. She called for an emergency session with full transparency and participation from all species, including those that had been excluded from the feast. Zethkor tried to regain control, arguing loudly that Jake's actions were sabotaged by a bitter species that had been rightfully denied entry. He claimed the evidence was fabricated or taken out of context. He insisted that the Council's authority came from traditions thousands of years old and could not be questioned by cubs who barely understood galactic politics. But his words fell flat. Too many council members had seen themselves in the recordings, saying things they could not deny. Too many civilizations across the galaxy were reacting with outrage and demands for explanations. The foundation of trust that had allowed the Council to function was crumbling in real time. Another voice joined the discussion, this one carrying even more weight than Kessa's. Luminarch Siva of the Altherian Ascendancy spoke, and when an Altherian spoke, everyone listened. The Altherians were among the oldest species in the galaxy, ancient beings of energy who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations. Their wisdom was respected even by the proudest elder races. Luminarch Seva acknowledged that the Council had strayed far from its founding principles. What had begun as an alliance to foster cooperation and mutual advancement had become a rigid hierarchy designed to preserve power for a few at the expense of many. The evidence Jake Morrison had presented was disturbing but not entirely surprising. The Altherians themselves had grown complacent, comfortable in their position, and unwilling to risk stability by pushing for reform. Siva proposed an immediate ceasefire and formal negotiations. She suggested that Jake Morrison and representatives of the observer species be granted temporary diplomatic immunity, while the Council investigated the accusations and considered structural reforms. This was not an admission of guilt, but a recognition that the situation required dialogue rather than violence. Not all elder species agreed. The Kronar Dominion's representative argued that granting immunity would reward criminal behavior and encourage other cubs to challenge authority. Several other elder races echoed this sentiment, fearing that any concession would undermine their power. But enough council members supported Siva's proposal that Zethkor could not unilaterally order Jake's arrest without triggering a deeper split within the council itself. Jake accepted the offer of diplomatic immunity, knowing this was only the beginning of a much longer struggle. The feast was officially suspended, and the council complex became the site of emergency deliberations. Over the following days, representatives from hundreds of species arrived, many of whom had never been invited to participate in council discussions before. The debates were intense and often angry. Jake and Clickthrum presented their case before the expanded assembly. They showed evidence not just of corruption, but of systematic exploitation that had lasted for generations. They demonstrated how the arbitrary requirements for feast attendance were designed to exclude, rather than evaluate. They revealed how innovation was suppressed and younger species were kept dependent through deliberate policies. Ryan worked with cultural representatives from dozens of species to draft a proposal for a new system of galactic governance. The proposal was based on values like cooperation, innovation and respect for all sentient life rather than on age, military power, or arbitrary historical precedents. It suggested that influence in galactic affairs should come from demonstrated contributions to the common good, rather than from ancient bloodlines or accumulated wealth. Sophie coordinated with military officers from various species to address security concerns. Many elder races feared that dismantling the hierarchy would lead to chaos and conflict. Sophie argued that the current system itself was causing instability by breeding resentment among younger species. A more equitable system would actually improve long-term security by giving everyone a stake in maintaining peace. Lisa worked closely with Clickthrum and other observer species to ensure their voices were heard throughout the process. For the first time in their history, these cubs were not just serving at the margins but were active participants in shaping galactic policy. They spoke about their experiences, their hopes, and their vision for a better future. But not everyone welcomed these changes. A faction of hardline elder species led by High Arbiter Zethkor worked to undermine the negotiations at every turn. They spread counter-narratives claiming the evidence had been manipulated. They threatened economic sanctions against species that supported reforms. They hinted at military force to restore what they called proper order. The Kronar Dominion openly sided with the hardliners, and their military power made the threat credible. Several other elder species joined them, enough to create a serious problem. These species controlled significant territory, resources, and military assets. If they chose to withdraw from the Council and form their own coalition, the galaxy could split into competing factions. The threat became explicit when Zethkor issued a formal ultimatum. Either the Council would restore its traditional structure within 10 days, or the hardline faction would secede and create their own alliance. They would take their fleets, their resources, and their territories with them. Any species that tried to interfere would face military consequences. The ultimatum sent shockwaves through the assembly. Many species that had supported reform now hesitated, fearing the galaxy was about to tear. Denied entry to the feast, cubs brought platters to the human. The tension in the council complex was unbearable as the deadline for the ultimatum approached. Jake Morrison spent sleepless nights trying to find a solution that would satisfy both the reform advocates and the hardline faction. But the gap between their positions seemed impossible to bridge. The hardliners wanted to preserve their power and privilege. The reformers wanted equality and justice. There was no middle ground that would make both sides happy. On the 7th day, Jake received a private request for a meeting from Luminarch Seva. The Altherian invited Jake to a quiet chamber away from the crowded assembly halls. When Jake arrived, he found Seva floating in her energy form, looking somehow both ancient and ageless. She got straight to the point and asked Jake a question that cut to the heart of everything. What did humanity really want from all this? Was this about revenge for being denied entry to the feast? Was it about gaining power and status for humans? Or was it truly about creating a better system for everyone? Seva explained that she needed to understand Jake's real motivations before she could decide how the Altherians would position themselves in the coming crisis. Jake took a long moment to consider his answer. He thought about his crew and the risks they had taken. He thought about Clickthrum and the observer species who had lived their entire lives in servitude. He thought about the countless civilizations across the galaxy who deserved better than the corrupt system that governed them. When he finally spoke, his words were honest and clear. Humanity did not want to replace the elder species at the top of the hierarchy. Humanity wanted to dismantle the hierarchy altogether. They wanted to create a galactic community where species cooperated based on mutual respect and shared goals, rather than on dominance and submission. They wanted a system where innovation was celebrated rather than suppressed, where younger species were mentored rather than exploited, and where every civilization had a voice in decisions that affected them. Seva listened carefully and then said something that surprised Jake. He admitted that the Altherians had known about the Council's corruption for a very long time. They had even benefited from it in some ways, but they had lacked the courage to challenge the system because change was risky and uncomfortable. It took an outsider, someone with nothing to lose and everything to gain, to force the issue into the open. Seva believed that Jake's vision was right and necessary, but she also knew that forcing change on species who were not ready would lead to conflict and suffering. The galaxy needed a path forward that allowed for transformation without tearing everything apart. She asked if Jake would be willing to consider an alternative approach. Before Siva could explain what she had in mind, Clickthrum requested an emergency meeting with Jake and the observer species representatives. The Kelthari had been in deep discussion with his people and other cubs, and they had developed an idea that might break the deadlock. Jake joined them in a smaller conference room where nearly 20 different species had gathered. Clickthrum presented their proposal. Instead of trying to force the elder species to change the existing council, they should create an alternative. Let the cubs and their allies form their own coalition, based on the principles Jake had been advocating. This new group would operate alongside the traditional council, but would use completely different rules. Membership would be open to any species regardless of age or size. Decisions would be made democratically. Technology and resources would be shared freely among members. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. It avoided direct confrontation with the hardliners while still providing a path forward for reform. Species could choose which system they preferred, and over time the superior model would naturally attract more members. The traditional council could continue existing for those who wanted to maintain the old ways, but it would no longer be the only option for galactic cooperation. Jake immediately saw the wisdom in this approach. It gave species freedom of choice rather than forcing them into one system or another. It allowed for peaceful competition between different models of governance. Most importantly, it avoided the civil war that seemed increasingly likely under the current trajectory. He brought the proposal to Luminarch Siva, who studied it carefully. After a long silence, she declared that the Altherians would support this plan. In fact, she went further and made a stunning announcement. The Altherian Ascendancy would join this new coalition as founding members alongside humanity and the observer species. When Siva made this declaration public in the next assembly session, the reaction was explosive. The Altherians were one of the most ancient and respected species in the galaxy. Their participation gave the new coalition immediate credibility and legitimacy. Other species quickly began expressing interest. The Therian Assembly joined within hours. Several mid-tier civilizations that had felt marginalized by the elder races announced their intention to participate. Even some smaller elder species, those who had always been overshadowed by the Vexthari and Kronar, quietly indicated they were interested in exploring this alternative. The movement was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. The coalition needed a name. After much discussion, they settled on calling it the Cooperative Union. The name emphasized their core principle of working together as equals rather than competing for dominance. Ryan drafted the charter with input from dozens of species, and the document was remarkable in its clarity and ambition. It promised open membership, democratic decision-making, free exchange of knowledge, mutual defense, and respect for the sovereignty of all member species. High Arbiter Zethkor and the Hardline faction were left in a difficult position. They could follow through on their threat to withdraw and form their own coalition, but doing so would isolate them and make them appear as the obstructionists. More importantly, many species that might have joined them were now interested in the Cooperative Union instead. The hardliners still had significant military power, but they were losing the political and moral arguments. After intense internal debate, most of the hardline species chose to remain within the traditional council structure rather than break away entirely. The council would continue to exist and would still have substantial influence over galactic affairs. But it was no longer the only game in town, and its members knew they would have to reform or risk becoming irrelevant. The story reached its conclusion with a new feast, but this one was completely different from the triumph feast that had started everything. The Cooperative Union hosted an inaugural gathering on a neutral world that Clickthrum helped select. Every species in the galaxy was invited with no prerequisites, no requirements, and no barriers to entry. The halls were filled with beings from hundreds of civilizations. Ancient species mingled with newly spacefaring ones. Former enemies shared meals and conversation. The atmosphere was hopeful and energized in a way that the old feast had never been. There were no servers or cubs because everyone participated equally in the preparation and celebration. The tables were filled with foods from countless cultures, each species contributing their own traditions and specialties. Jake Morrison stood with his crew watching the gathering unfold. Sophie looked proud and satisfied. Ryan was already deep in conversation with a group of diplomats from species Jake did not recognize. Lisa stood quietly nearby, more comfortable observing than participating, but Jake could see the small smile on her face that showed she understood the significance of what they had accomplished. Click-Thrum approached Jake carrying 2 cups of some luminescent beverage. The Kelthari offered one to Jake, and they stood together watching the crowd. Click-Thrum said that he had served at many feasts in his long life, always as a subordinate hoping for scraps of recognition. This was the first time he attended as an equal, and the feeling was almost overwhelming. Luminarch Siva joined them, her energy form glowing softly in the ambient light. She thanked Jake for having the courage to challenge a system that needed changing. She admitted that the Altherians should have done it themselves long ago, but had grown too comfortable in their position of power. Sometimes it took an outsider with fresh eyes to see what insiders had learned to ignore. Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Humanity had been denied entry to the Triumph Feast and dismissed as cubs too young to matter. That rejection had hurt, but it had also opened Jake's eyes to the deeper problems in galactic civilization. The cubs had not accepted their exclusion quietly. Instead, they had worked together to expose corruption and build something better. They had brought Platters to the feast, but not as servants. They brought Platters laden with truth, courage, and a vision for a galaxy where all species could thrive together. They had been told to wait another millennium before they would be ready to join the established order. Instead, they created a new order that was ready to welcome them immediately. Jake knew that the challenges were far from over. The cooperative union would face difficulties as it grew. There would be disagreements among members, threats from outside, and the constant work of maintaining democratic governance across hundreds of different species. The traditional council would continue to exist and would likely compete with